Hello, my fear seekers. I'm your fear master, and tonight I have a story that will make you think twice before taking on a night shift. Imagine being a security guard in an old, eerie building, alone in the dark, only to find out that the rules you must follow are not just guidelines, but a matter of life and death. Let's dive into the chilling tale of the night shift rules. My name is Daniel Williams, and I worked as a night security guard in an old office building downtown. It was my first day on the job, and I had heard stories about how strange the night shift could be, but I never imagined what I was about to experience. I arrived at the building at 10 p.m. The place had an eerie atmosphere, with its flickering lights and long, empty hallways. Upon entering, the head of security, an older man named Mr. Roberts, greeted me with a serious expression. "Daniel, there are some rules you need to follow strictly during your shift," he said, handing me a sheet of paper. "Do not ignore them for any reason." I thought it was a joke or some sort of tradition for newcomers, but his tone made it clear he was serious. I glanced at the sheet while Mr. Roberts continued talking. "These rules aren't there for no reason. If you want to survive the night, follow them to the letter." The rules were as follows. 1. Never look directly at the security cameras between 12 o'clock a.m. and 3 o'clock a.m. 2. If you hear a whisper, do not respond or try to find the source of the sound. 3. Always carry a flashlight and never rely on the building's lights. 4. If you encounter someone who shouldn't be in the building, do not speak to them or try to approach them. Simply report it to the head of security. 5. At 2:33 a.m., you must be in the control room, lock the door, and do not leave until the clock strikes 3 o'clock a.m. The list went on, but those were the most important. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Whispers? People who shouldn't be there? It all seemed like something out of a horror story. But Mr. Roberts wasn't smiling. He was completely serious. "Is everything clear?" he asked. I nodded, even though I had many questions. I decided to follow the rules and not take any chances. The night started quietly. I did my initial rounds without any issues, checking each floor and making sure everything was in order. The building was large, with many offices and seemingly endless hallways. Shadows seemed to move with every step I took, but I told myself it was just my imagination. At midnight, things started to get strange. While checking the security cameras, I noticed one of them, the one facing the basement, showed a dark figure moving. I remembered the first rule and quickly looked away. My heart was pounding, but I carried on. At 1 o'clock a.m., I heard a whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I remembered the second rule and stood still, holding my breath. The whisper grew louder, as if someone was right behind me. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing. Finally, the whisper faded. I felt relieved, but the tension didn't leave me. At 2:33 a.m., as instructed, I made my way to the control room and locked the door. I sat down and waited. The cameras showed empty hallways, but something felt off. At 2:45 a.m., the camera on the 7th floor showed a woman with long black hair, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, walking slowly. A chill ran down my spine. Her eyes were empty, like two black voids. I remembered the rule about not looking directly at the cameras and turned away, but the image was burned into my mind. Finally, the clock struck 3 o'clock a.m. I left the control room and continued my rounds. Nothing else seemed out of the ordinary, but the feeling of being watched never left me. When my shift ended at 6 o'clock a.m., I met Mr. Roberts at the entrance. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah, everything's fine," I lied, still haunted by the woman on the camera. "Good. Remember, follow the rules and you'll be safe." I nodded and left, wanting to forget about that night. But I knew I couldn't. The experience had left a mark on me, and although I continued working there, I always did so with a mix of fear and respect for the rules. I knew my life depended on them. The next few nights were uneventful, though I never let my guard down. I followed the rules meticulously, avoiding the cameras during the forbidden hours, ignoring any whispers, and ensuring I was locked in the control room at the specified time. My nerves were constantly on edge, but I was starting to get used to the routine. One night, about a week into the job, things took a turn for the worse. It was around 1:15 a.m. when I heard it again. A whisper, but this time it was louder, more insistent. I froze, remembering the second rule. My heart pounded as the whisper grew into a murmur, then a low chant. It felt as if the sound was enveloping me, surrounding me from all sides. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. I fumbled for my flashlight, cursing under my breath. The building plunged into darkness, and the only sound was the persistent whisper. I managed to turn on my flashlight and directed its beam down the hallway, but it did little to cut through the oppressive darkness. I decided to head to the control room early. As I walked, I felt a presence behind me, but I didn't dare turn around. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I saw a shadow dart across the wall. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I reached the control room, locked the door, and slumped into the chair, trying to calm myself. The cameras showed the usual empty hallways, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. At 2:33 a.m., the whispering became a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate than the last. The camera on the 7th floor flickered again. The woman was back, but this time she wasn't alone. Shadows moved behind her, indistinct shapes that seemed to pulse and writhe. I looked away, heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices. The door to the control room rattled, as if someone was trying to force it open. I checked the clock. 2:50 a.m. 10 more minutes. I held my breath, praying the door would hold. At 3 o'clock a.m., the whispering stopped abruptly. I unlocked the door and stepped out, flashlight ready. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick with tension. I finished my rounds, each step feeling like it took an eternity. As my shift ended, I met Mr. Roberts at the entrance. "Rough night?" he asked, noticing my pale face. "You could say that," I replied, my voice shaking. "Remember, the rules are there for a reason. Don't ever forget that." I nodded, too exhausted to argue or ask questions. As I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something that was growing bolder with each passing night. The next night, I arrived at the building with a sense of dread. I knew I had to follow the rules, but a part of me feared it wouldn't be enough. The memory of the woman's empty eyes and the relentless whispering haunted me. As I began my rounds, I noticed something strange. The air felt heavier, and there was an unsettling stillness in the building. I reached the 3rd floor when I saw it, an open door to an office that should have been locked. My flashlight revealed an empty room, but the air inside felt colder, almost frigid. Ignoring the growing sense of dread, I closed the door and continued my patrol. At 12:45 a.m., I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. The whispering started again, louder than ever. I made my way to the control room, heart racing. Locking the door, I sat down and tried to steady my breathing. The cameras showed nothing unusual, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. At 2:33 a.m., the whispering became a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate than the last. The camera on the 7th floor flickered again. The woman was back, but this time she wasn't alone. Shadows moved behind her, indistinct shapes that seemed to pulse and writhe. I looked away, heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices. The door to the control room rattled, as if someone was trying to force it open. I checked the clock. 2:50 a.m. 10 more minutes. I held my breath, praying the door would hold. At 3 o'clock a.m., the whispering stopped abruptly. I unlocked the door and stepped out, flashlight ready. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick with tension. I finished my rounds, each step feeling like it took an eternity. As my shift ended, I met Mr. Roberts at the entrance. "Daniel, there's something you need to know," he said, his voice more serious than ever. "What is it?" I asked, my anxiety spiking. "There's a door in the basement," he began. "It's always been there, but it's sealed off. Recently, the seal has been weakening. If it opens, it could let out whatever's been trapped inside." My blood ran cold. "What do we do?" "We need to reinforce the seal," he said. "Tonight, after your shift, I need you to help me." I agreed, knowing I had no choice. That night, as I made my rounds, I felt a growing sense of dread. The whispering was louder than ever, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. I made it to the control room at 2:33 a.m., locked the door, and waited. At 2:45 a.m., the woman appeared again, but this time she was closer. Her eyes seemed to bore into mine through the camera. I quickly looked away, heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices. The door to the control room rattled violently, as if someone, or something, was trying to break in. I checked the clock, 2:50 a.m., just 10 more minutes. I closed my eyes, focusing on the rules. At 3 o'clock a.m., the whispering stopped abruptly. I unlocked the door and stepped out, flashlight in hand. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. I finished my rounds, each step feeling like it took an eternity. When my shift ended, Mr. Roberts was waiting for me. "Are you ready?" he asked. I nodded, fear gripping my heart. Together we made our way to the basement. The air grew colder, and the whispering returned, louder than ever. We reached the door, its seal glowing faintly. "Hold the flashlight," Mr. Roberts instructed, pulling out a set of tools. He worked quickly, reinforcing the seal. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening. "Hurry," I urged, my voice barely audible over the noise. Finally, Mr. Roberts finished. The seal glowed brightly and the whispering stopped. The seal glowed brightly, and the whispering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost as unsettling as the noise had been. We both stood there, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. "Is it over?" I asked, barely able to believe what we had just witnessed. For now, Mr. Roberts replied, wiping sweat from his brow. We've reinforced the seal, but we need to remain vigilant. This isn't a permanent solution. I nodded, still gripping the flashlight tightly. As we made our way back upstairs, the oppressive feeling began to lift slightly. The building felt a little less sinister, but I knew better than to let my guard down. "Thank you, Daniel," Mr. Roberts said as we reached the ground floor. "You did well tonight. Just remember to keep following the rules." "I will," I promised, feeling a sense of camaraderie with the older man. "We'll get through this." With that, I left the building, the dawn light beginning to break over the city. I couldn't wait to get home and collapse into bed, but the events of the night kept replaying in my mind. As exhausted as I was, sleep didn't come easily. Over the next few nights, the building seemed quieter. The whispering was still present, but it was faint, almost distant. The shadows seemed less threatening. I hoped that reinforcing the seal had made a lasting impact. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, about a week later, I arrived at the building to find Mr. Roberts waiting for me at the entrance. His expression was grave, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. "Daniel, we need to talk," he said, motioning for me to follow him inside. We made our way to the control room, where he closed the door behind us and sat down, gesturing for me to do the same. "I've been doing some research," he began, pulling out a stack of old documents. "This building has a long and dark history. It was built on the site of an old asylum, and many of the patients who lived here never left." My heart sank as I looked through the documents. Newspaper clippings, old photographs, and reports of strange occurrences all pointed to one thing. The spirits of the asylum's patients were still here, and they were growing stronger. "The seal we reinforced in the basement was meant to contain the darkest of these spirits," Mr. Roberts continued. "But it's only a temporary fix. We need to find a way to permanently put them to rest." "How do we do that?" I asked, feeling a mix of fear and determination. "There's a ritual," he said, showing me an old tattered book. "It's risky, but it might be our only chance. We need to perform it in the basement, at the site of the seal." I agreed, knowing that this might be our only chance to stop the haunting once and for all. We spent the next few nights preparing, gathering the necessary materials and memorizing the steps of the ritual. The night of the ritual, the building felt more oppressive than ever. The whispering was louder, and the shadows seemed to move with purpose. As we made our way to the basement, the air grew colder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. We reached the door with the glowing seal. Mr. Roberts set up the materials for the ritual, and we began to chant the incantations from the book. The air grew colder still, and the whispering became a deafening roar. Suddenly, the seal began to crack, and a dark, shapeless figure emerged from the door. Its eyes were empty voids, and it exuded a malevolent presence. My heart pounded in my chest as Mr. Roberts and I continued to chant, our voices barely audible over the cacophony. The figure lunged at us, but an invisible barrier held it back. The seal glowed brighter as our chanting intensified. With a final, desperate effort, we completed the ritual, and the figure let out a blood-curdling scream before dissolving into nothingness. The whispering stopped, and the air grew noticeably warmer. The oppressive feeling that had permeated the building for so long seemed to lift, replaced by a strange sense of peace. Mr. Roberts and I stood there in stunned silence, catching our breath. The seal on the door glowed one last time before fading back to normal, leaving no trace of the dark presence that had emerged. "Is it over?" I asked, barely able to believe what we had just witnessed. "I think so," Mr. Roberts replied, his voice tinged with both relief and exhaustion. "The ritual seems to have worked. The spirits should be at rest now." We cleaned up the remnants of the ritual and made our way back upstairs. The building felt different, lighter somehow. As we exited the building, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the city. "Thank you, Daniel," Mr. Roberts said as we reached the entrance. "We couldn't have done this without you." "It was a team effort," I replied, feeling a sense of camaraderie with the older man. "Let's hope this is the end of it." With that, I left the building, finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. The events of the past few weeks had left a mark on me, but I felt stronger, knowing I had faced the unknown and survived. As I walked home, I couldn't help but glance back at the building one last time. It stood there, silent and still, a reminder of the dark secrets it once held. But for the first time, I felt that those secrets were finally laid to rest. And so, my fear-seekers, the tale of the night shift rules comes to an end. Daniel and Mr. Roberts faced the darkness and emerged victorious. But remember, not all haunted places are as forgiving. Some rules are meant to be followed, no matter how strange they seem. Until next time, stay vigilant and keep your fears close. You never know when you might need them.